The sun rose on Christmas morning 1945, but for the Sodder family, there would be no peace. No presents, no celebration, only ashes. Where their two-story home had stood just hours before, there was now a smoking hole in the ground. George and Jennie Sodder stood in shock, their surviving children huddled around them, staring at the ruins, waiting for answers that would never come. Fire Chief F.J. Maurice arrived late that morning. His department, like many during the war years, was understaffed and poorly equipped. Many of the town's young men were still overseas. The response had been catastrophically slow, 6 hours too late. Maurice and his men searched through the ashes. They found melted appliances, fragments of the tin roof, charred personal items. But they did not find what they expected to find. They did not find bodies. According to one account, they did find a few small bone fragments and what may have been internal organs. But if they did, they chose not to tell the family. Instead, Maurice gave the Sodders an explanation that defied science, logic, and common sense. The fire had burned so intensely, he said, that the children's bodies had been completely cremated. Nothing was left. 5 children, 5 bodies, reduced to nothing but smoke. George Sodder was not a man who accepted easy answers. He looked at the wreckage of his home and saw things that made no sense. Questions that demanded answers. The Christmas lights had remained on throughout the fire. If faulty wiring had caused the blaze, wouldn't the power have been disrupted? Wouldn't the lights have gone out? The phone line was dead. But when investigators checked, they discovered something that should have immediately reopened the case. The line hadn't been burned through. It had been cut, cleanly, deliberately, by someone who climbed a 14-foot pole and severed the line with a tool. And then there was the ladder. George always kept a ladder propped against the side of the house, every single night. It was his only way to reach the second floor, the attic, the bedrooms where his children slept. On the night of the fire, when George tried to find it, the ladder was gone. He and his sons searched desperately in the darkness, in the chaos, in the panic. It was nowhere to be found. Days later, it was discarded in a ditch, 75 feet away from the house. Someone had moved it. Someone had made sure George couldn't reach his children. With the ladder missing, George had another idea. He owned 2 coal trucks, parked nearby. If he could drive one up to the house, he could climb onto the roof, break through, reach the attic window. He jumped into the first truck, turned the key. Nothing. He ran to the second truck, turned the key. Nothing. Both engines, which had worked perfectly the day before, refused to start. In the freezing December air, they were useless. Dead. Sabotage. There was a barrel of water near the house that could have been used to fight the flames. It was frozen solid. Solid ice. George smashed a window with his bare hands, trying to get inside. The glass cut deep into his arm. His blood dripped onto the snow as he watched the flames consume the upper floors, consume his children. For 45 minutes, the Sodder family watched their home burn. They screamed the children's names into the night. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty. They heard nothing in return. No cries for help, no answering calls. Just the roar of the flames and the crackling of wood. By the time the fire finally burned itself out, the 5 children had simply ceased to exist, at least according to the official story. On December 26th, just 2 days after the fire, a coroner's inquest was convened. The verdict came quickly, suspiciously quickly. The fire was an accident, they declared, caused by faulty wiring. Death certificates for the 5 children were issued on December 30th. Cause of death, fire or suffocation, Case closed. Move along. Nothing to see here. But there was a detail that would later send chills down the spines of anyone who examined the case. A detail that should have made every single person in that room stop and ask questions. Sitting on that coroner's jury was a man George Sodder recognized. A man who, just 2 months earlier, had threatened his family. Let that sink in. The man who helped decide that the fire was an accident, that the children were dead, that no further investigation was needed, was the same man who had promised to destroy George Sodder's family. In October 1945, an insurance salesman had come to the Sodder home, trying to sell George a policy on his children. George refused. The man became angry. As he left, he turned and delivered a chilling warning. "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke," he said, "and your children are going to be destroyed. You'll have to answer for all the dirty remarks you've made about Mussolini." George Sodder was a vocal opponent of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. In the close-knit Italian immigrant community of Fayetteville, those opinions had made enemies. Mussolini had been executed months earlier, but the passions he inspired had not died. The hatred remained. And now, the man who had threatened George was sitting on the jury that declared his children's deaths an accident. The man who predicted the fire was now judging it. George and Jennie didn't know what to believe. They were drowning in grief. But slowly, almost against their will, they began to question everything they'd been told. And the more questions they asked, the more impossible the official story became. Jennie Sodder began conducting her own experiments. She took chicken bones and burned them in her kitchen stove. She took bones from pork chops and burned them in open fires in her yard. She watched them char. She watched them blacken. But they never disappeared. They always remained recognizable. She contacted a local crematorium and asked a simple question. How hot does a fire have to be to completely destroy human bone? The answer she received would change everything. The crematorium told her that even after 2 hours at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, human bones do not vanish. They remain intact enough to be identified. They remain as evidence, as proof. The Sodder house fire had burned for approximately 45 minutes, and while it was hot, it had not melted the metal appliances in the home. Those were found, twisted but recognizable, in the ashes. So here's the question that no one could answer. If the fire was hot enough to completely cremate 5 human bodies, why were there metal objects that had survived? Why were there appliances, roof fragments, personal items but no bones? Where were the bodies of 5 children? The official explanation was collapsing under its own weight. And as the Sodders dug deeper, they uncovered more disturbing details. Witnesses came forward. A man had been seen removing equipment from the Sodder property on the night of the fire. That man was later identified and arrested for theft. He admitted to stealing a block and tackle from George's garage. And he admitted to something else. He admitted to cutting the telephone line. He claimed he thought the phone line was an electrical wire, a convenient excuse. He denied any involvement in the fire itself. But his actions had ensured one thing. When the fire started, the Sodders could not call for help. The phones were dead. And they stayed dead. By early 1946, George and Jennie Sodder had reached a conclusion that defied all logic and official pronouncement. They believed their children were not dead. They believed the fire had been set deliberately to cover something up. And they believed that somewhere, somehow, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty were still alive. Think about that. A mother and father standing in the ashes of their home, surrounded by the wreckage of their lives, refusing to accept that their children were gone. Not because they couldn't face the truth, but because the truth didn't fit the evidence. A missing ladder, 2 dead trucks, a cut phone line, a strange phone call, a mysterious bang on the roof, a threatening man on the jury, and 5 bodies that simply did not exist. If the children had survived, where were they? Who had taken them, and why? The search for answers was about to lead the Sodders down a path filled with mysterious sightings, dead ends, and haunting photographs. But before we go there, let me ask you something. If you were George Sodder, standing in those ashes, seeing what he saw, knowing what he knew, would you have accepted the official story? Or would you have spent the rest of your life searching for the truth? The Sodders chose to search, and what they found would only deepen the mystery. We'll continue after this short break.